Good morning, party people, or afternoon, I suppose. It's about 1:37 p.m. here in Cabo. The view that you see when we're starting up is actually from my office. I can wheel that around. That's the camera right out there that shoots out, looking out at the beach. And you might ask why I don't just have the beach in the background the whole time while I'm shooting. Well, it's because it's so bright that my webcast viewers would have to wear shades. You wouldn't be able to see me at all. You would just only be able to see the bright beach, which is probably not a problem for most of you. Most of you would probably prefer that. And that's why also, too, when I do a lot of these webcasts, I go out there. Greg Dodd, good to see you, Greg. And I saw your question in, Greg, in one of the office hours queues, too. It says I'm here for the beach. That's awesome. So let's see here. First up, we have in the highly voted queue over at PollGab, we have Sean asks, I've got a new app with a data model to be determined. What's the thought process one should go through and questions should be asked to determine whether it's relational or non-relational should be used? So here's the question that I usually ask is how can we get away with using non-relational? Because it's so freaking cheap. I have a blog post coming out tomorrow or 2 days from now. I think it's tomorrow as we record this, so it'd be Thursday of this week, where I talk about PollGab.com's database and the hosting costs. So PollGab's that thing we use up there to do the questions. Our hosting cost for the month of February was $1.85. Out of that $1.85, that included our database costs. $1 of it was DNS, like 2 domains at 50 cents a piece. Like 70 some cents was CloudWatch monitoring. And we didn't even use enough Amazon DynamoDB to cost 1 penny. The more that your company has to pay, the less their bills cost, the more they can pay meat bags like you. So I'm all about saving money where we can on hosting. So that's why I would totally start with, can we get away with non-relational, especially modern non-relational data storage layers that don't cost you a fixed cost all the time, whether you're running queries or not. So, howdy, 3, what is it, Ender? Oh, Ender, okay, cool. Next up, we have My Friend Asks, my friend's server has a database and is getting several apps connected to that database. For some reason, they get timeouts on the applications on Tuesdays. How do we figure out what's causing the timeouts? Search for Brent Ozar timeouts. That gives me visions of me sitting in a corner somewhere. But if you search for Brent Ozar timeouts, I've got like 3 different blog posts explaining techniques that you can use. I recognize that you're lazy and you just figured you could put it in here instead of Google, but you'd be amazed at what you can actually find quicker in Google than you can by posting your questions somewhere. Isn't that intriguing? Next up, Goose asks, what's the danger zone rate for inserts per second? And I love the name Goose for this. This is really slick because he's thinking Top Gun, Goose, look out for that highway to the danger zone. What's the danger zone rate for inserts per second in SQL Server, and what's the highest you've seen? So for me, I start to get nervous at around 1,000 inserts per second sustained, not because it's hard, but because meatbags like to step up to their keyboard and do things like run reports or type begin tran or change the data model without thinking about what the repercussions are. And when you're doing 1,000, hello, Netherlands. When you're doing 1,000 inserts per second, it's real easy for someone to try to take out a table lock and cause a blocking firestorm. So 1,000 continued inserts per second is where I'd start to wake up and go, we got to start being more disciplined as an organization. I've seen 100,000 inserts per second sustained, and that's extremely challenging. That's the point where you have to start thinking about, I may have to rip out foreign keys, for example, because the overhead for foreign keys might be too high. Hello, Spitfire. Are you going to Bits? I don't know if you're going to Bits. Spitfire's in the United Kingdom, I believe. So I'm going to be over at Bits, flying over to Bits Saturday. Looking forward to that. Very excited about that. Next up, we have, I use lowercase for select. I love it. I use lowercase for select says, hi Brent, my friend is looking at your alerting script and wants to implement it. I wonder which one that is. Oh, unfortunately, oh, that's a bummer, man. He says, also they want their system monitoring system to get notified using SNMP traps. Do you have any advice on this? No, absolutely not. I don't use SNMP at all for alerting. I would say to whoever wants to use SNMP, great, you have a hammer. I understand that you're looking for places to use that hammer. But if you would like to use that hammer to build a china cabinet, I'm going to need you to show me how you use that hammer to build a china cabinet, but otherwise it's not really a suitable tool for doing things like SQL Server monitoring. Next up, Sohil asks, do physical reads versus logical reads ever matter for performance tuning? I tell people never look at physical reads, period, full stop, end of story. If you want to learn more about why, watch my totally free class, How to Think Like the SQL Server Engine. Because generally, as long as your query is reading less pages, it doesn't matter whether they're coming out of memory or not. The reason behind that is because just because your query isn't doing any physical reads doesn't mean you're not causing problems for other queries. Because if we can tune your query to read less data, even if that data is cached in RAM, then everybody else will be able to cache more stuff too. They'll be able to keep their stuff up in memory and their queries will go faster when you tune your crappy query. So what you do when you're tuning queries is look at the top most read-intensive queries, assuming that your bottleneck is things like page IO latch, reading data pages from a data file. Tune whichever queries are reading pages regardless of which place they're reading them from. Had to go open up a blind. It's real windy here in Mexico today, so I had to like open that up so that I could stop hearing the thing bang against my wall. Next up in the question list of doom, Robert asks, hi Brent, do you have a Goldilocks methodology? Sounds kind of weird. For determining the optimal number of inserts to perform in a transaction so that transaction log writes are optimized? Nope. So what you want to aim for is, how many rows do you need to insert? Well, that's how many you should insert. If you find yourself getting to the point where you're trying to micromanage what SQL Server is doing with the transaction log, you're probably not looking at what the biggest problem is on the server. It's like we're trying to tune the placement of the deck chairs on the Titanic. Take a step back and look at what the server's overall biggest problem is. I pretty much guarantee you it's not that. I'm not saying it'll never be that, but usually when I see people trying to polish things like that, they're like, I know this Yugo would go a lot faster if I just get the rear view mirrors aimed exactly right. And I'm like, no, it's a Yugo. It's a Yugo. Don't worry too much about that. Next up, we'll take a couple of the newer questions that just popped in from live attendees here. So RenegadeLarsen, which Renegade, you've got email too. What is best, Brent, CPUs, memory, or fast disks? For me, memory, because memory affects not only the ability to make up for fast storage, but it also gives you the ability to do sorts and joins in memory, like query workspace RAM. So that usually for me is a way better bang for the buck. It's less expensive than fast disks, especially when we start to get up in the cloud. And of course, it's way less expensive than CPU. Since SQL Server's licensed by the CPU. Next up. Kendra Little says, what is your favorite isolation level and why is it NOLOCK? That is an excellent question. I like that. Hopefully, Kendra, you're having a good time moving into your new home. Hopefully that closing process worked quite well. That's good. I love that question. Next up in the new questions, Sqlsucks asks, I'm not going to take offense to that, because after all, I was just plugging DynamoDB a second ago. Hello, Brent. In today's world where things are changing so fast, I want you to think back to a time in history where things weren't changing so fast. Tell me about a time for your parents or grandparents where they thought things were slow and normal. I don't think that there's been one, but I'll continue. What would you recommend to learn new to someone who has 5 to 6 years of experience with SQL Server? I would assume cloud is the future, but please explain where I should focus. So the thing, that's true too. That's true too. So the thing is, with learning cloud, there are parts of the cloud that are essentially self-managing that you don't really have to worry about that much. And there are other parts of the cloud that are very changing quickly. They're very unstable. They're very unpredictable. So if you want to learn to deploy large groups of VMs in the cloud, right now you've got a lot of different ways to do it. The tooling is immature and the tooling changes all the time. So unless your company is actively using it, I wouldn't learn tools that are changing all the time just for speculative purposes, because the times that you need to actually use them, the tools may have changed so completely. I'll give you a great example. We're about to have SQL Bits, which is the biggest conference over in Europe for Microsoft SQL Server and the Microsoft Data Platform. And it's going to happen because this happens every year. There's going to be a presenter who's talking about Azure or Terraform or Kubernetes or something. They're going to be up on the stage. They're going to go run their demo live in front of a group of people. It's going to be a demo that they have rehearsed multiple times in the months leading up to this event. And you know what they're going to say? Wait a minute. Someone changed something at Microsoft or Amazon or Google, and my demo no longer works the way that I thought it was going to work. Or they'll look at the Azure portal and they'll go, wait a minute, something changed. The cloud right now is changing like crazy, whereas on-premises SQL Server and VM SQL Server really isn't changing all that much. So if you're going to pick something to learn, the thing that I would pick to learn is either something that your company is doing today or helps them solve a problem that they would implement that solution like tomorrow. Just because otherwise you can easily run into a thing where you're learning something that gets discontinued or works completely differently 6 months from now. You just only have so many hours in the day, so it gets risky to waste your training time on that. And next, we'll take one more new one before I go switch back over the highest voted ones. Greg asks, the leading column of an index is very selective. There's only around 5 rows for over 95% of the values. But the stats in the histogram shows hundreds or thousands of rows expected. If I rebuild stats, it gets a lot better if I do a full scan. Okay, so when SQL Server samples statistics, and Stack Overflow's display name is a great example of that, or location. These are columns that are very unique. Location is very widely distributed. People tend to put, it's a free text column. People can put in things like at your parents' house or under your basement. They get real creative with a text column or varchar. So when SQL Server samples a small percentage of the rows, SQL Server thinks, oh, the rest of the rows must have these same values. And so you get it as just as if it sampled all the rows, but there were just more rows for each value, which isn't true. There are more unique values. So you said, how do I get it better without a full scan? Try a higher sampling rate. You have to walk the balance between a high enough sampling rate versus a too long of a job. But here's the thing. I say that a lot, and I got to work on that. If you have data distribution like that, you don't have to update stats very often, because if the values are pretty unique, update the stats once, and then any new incoming values, SQL Server is going to assume that there's 1 row or 5 rows involved with them, because that's what your data distribution looks like, and you're fine. That's a great example of how you could be able to update that particular stat once a month or every 6 months. Greg followed up in Twitch and said, can I do that with OLA's scripts? Yes. It gets harder when you want to do it on a table by table and an index by index or a stat by stat basis. Because by default, you just pass in a sampling percentage to OLA's scripts and it uses it across the board for everything. You're now, though, at the customized point where you want to have one stats job with OLA for specific indexes where you're getting fancy with this, and another job that lists all, or that doesn't list all of them, but just says all the indexes and stats except those. OLA's script takes minus signs as values for exclusions. So you can say everything except users dot whatever statistic you're worried about. All right, next up in the highly voted category, we have Leroy Jenkins. And Leroy says, what's your opinion on some peeps' advice of do not install Management Studio on the SQL Server and do not remote desktop into the SQL Server? So I'll tell you what my job is. My job is to fix performance problems. And people pay me a lot of money, enough money that I have a house in Mexico and 2 Porsches and a Jaguar. People pay me a lot of money to fix performance problems, and then I'll go in and we'll find 2 active remote desktop sessions on the SQL Server, and I'll say, Alice, why do you have an open RDP session on the SQL Server? And she'll say, well, you know what? I was doing some work yesterday on analysis. And I'm like, this is why you can't have nice things. If you're causing unpredictable performance slowdowns on the SQL Server itself, because things like SQL Server aren't great at digesting large amounts of data, I've seen instances where Management Studio will drain a box dry of RAM and cause the SQL Server process to page out. Don't go in there. It's not your business. That's not what it's for. I am fine with people installing Management Studio for emergency purposes, but if you're going to go about doing that, I also suggest using your favorite monitoring tool and setting an alert on the number of remote desktop sessions that are open. There's a perfmon counter for that. And then when it's anything other than 0, email the whole entire team every 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Because there must be an emergency on the SQL Server if someone's remote desktoping into it. And if you find that someone is regularly doing that just because, well, I wanted to run a query and I wanted to see what was going on, then no, you lose your permissions to go remote desktop into the SQL Server because you're just clearly not qualified. Next up, we have Megurine Luka. RenegadeLarsen says, "Hey Brent, a Little House is also nice." I assume that you mean like the TV show. It's been a while since I've seen that, though. I didn't watch too much of it. I can't get into scripted TV shows anymore. Like the only kind of TV show that I do these days are unscripted reality TV shows. But that's because I'm not that bright, because I drink a lot. Next up, we have Margarine Luka. That's not true. Megurine Luka, which I really like that name. I like both of those names, actually. Both the first and last name are pretty awesome. Megurine Luka, and I'm probably butchering it, but I like it when it sounds that way. It's pretty cool. Says, "Hi Brent, I can run the same query in Management Studio and in Sentry One Plan Explorer. Sentry One shows different things that I don't see in Management Studio. Have you experienced this as well?" So for a while there, I was using Plan Explorer, and then after Sentry One got bought out by SolarWinds, it seemed like SolarWinds just stopped completely improving Sentry One Plan Explorer. It just kind of died on the vine. So because of that, I don't know if it's like marching towards death or whatever, but I stopped teaching with it because it doesn't seem to be getting any improvements. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I just haven't used it at all lately to where I would recommend it to people. Does it show more details than Management Studio? Absolutely. It's also one of those tools that's kind of designed by developers for developers, not necessarily easy to use. Next up, we have ProductionDBA says, "Hi Brent, I'm very excited for the new SQL Server 2022. I wanted to test it, but I'm still new to the SQL world. I was wondering if you'd ever participated in an early adoption program of any of the old versions, and what is expected to do and to test. What feedback do you need to provide?" You have to run it in production. And that's kind of a big ask. That's what the Microsoft people like to say. They use ask as a noun. That's a big ask to use I have to be careful to pronounce the K because it's also the other pronunciation. But it's a big ask to ask a company to run SQL Server 2022 in production when there's no, my office is in a bedroom actually. But that's a door. There's a light here. This is one of the lights that I use when I'm doing green screen work. And then that's my door into the bedroom, wooden door. There is an AC, but it's back over in another direction. When there's no way to restore a SQL Server 2022 database to an earlier version of SQL Server. So if you hit a showstopper bug, if you have some kind of problem, The way to, yes, absolutely, that's true. The only way to unwind that is you have to sit there and work with Microsoft until they can get the bug fixed. And that would be a big problem if you're facing a production down type situation. So the only thing that I would ever recommend clients go to a early access program for is if they have a non-mission critical application. I'll give you a great idea or a great example. One of my clients was doing a 20 terabyte data warehouse, and they were hitting a real specific problem with column store indexes on 2016. So they went to and they knew that 2017 didn't fix it. We already tried that. So they went to the early adoption program of 2019, trying to see if they could work around the problem. Because it was a data warehouse, and if we talk with the business and we're like, if it goes down for a day or two, does it really matter? And they're like, well, it would suck, but if it solves the problem, column store problem, then it's worth it. And they were on calls with Microsoft every week, every day when they were hitting problems. So it is a non-trivial amount of work. Next up, VISHAKHAPATNAM, who I should yell it because it's all in caps. That's very important, clearly. Hi, Brent. What options should be used to create a new index in the fastest time possible? Well, it's funny that you say that because I have a class that happens to talk about those exact kinds of things. Coming up, we have our our Fundamentals Week live series, where for 5 days straight, I'm teaching you the fundamentals of index tuning, fundamentals of query tuning, fundamentals of parameter sniffing, how I use the first responder kit, and more. The options to create indexes quickly happens to be a part of that. So you can register for that over at brentozar.com/go/fundamentals. So that's brentozar.com/go/fundamentals. Next up, I hate it when I accidentally trigger the music. I hit the wrong button there. There we go. Got rid of that. Next up, we have Marcus the German. Oh, good to see you. Marcus the German says, hi, Brent. Could you tell us anything about the persisted log buffer or non-volatile memory tail of log caching? Oh, God. So this feature came out at a really bad time. This feature came out at the exact same time where the world is starting to move towards the cloud. And so it is, Renegade's a tier 1 for 4 months. Thank you. Woohoo. That's very cool. But wait, there's more. So this feature comes out, and Microsoft is like, hey, if you're having this really edge case problem, now there's hardware from Intel that can help, but you have to buy a specific kind of server in order to get it. This doesn't really make sense for virtualization. It doesn't really make sense for the cloud. So if you think about, I know we're not supposed to think about pie charts, but if you think about a pie chart, the percentage of servers that are physical, it's already drops down by a lot. Number of servers that are having this problem drops down even smaller. Number of servers that are physical and having this problem and could go to NVDIMM storage. I mean, there's like nothing. There's probably like 3 SQL servers in the world that are having that particular problem. So it's not something that I would bother investigating for the purposes of your career, because just especially in the day and age of the cloud, it's really hard to find people who are buying brand new SQL servers to solve a really edge case problem, like not being able to write to the transaction log fast enough. And usually when I do see people who are running into problems, they're hitting write log waits, and it's because their storage is consisted of stone tablets. And I'm like, okay, just throw the transaction log on either something like Pure Storage or local NVMe storage, and then that just makes the problem go away and we're done. The other thing to keep in mind is that when you see edge case solutions like that, where they're like, we're going to get every last bit of log throughput that we can, those shops are also willing to lose data in the event of a failover, because that storage is local only to the SQL Server itself. The instant that you want to start doing anything like synchronous always-on availability groups, well, there, boom goes the latency, because you're just immediately going to add on a whole lot more latency than that to write over to the sync secondary that's another node. And let's see here. Next up, we have from the new questions, Lifeless DBA. Goodness gracious. Lifeless DBA says, hi, Brent. What would be the reasons behind creation of stats on a column in a read-only secondary? Well, the primary database has a stat on that very same column. That's really, I don't want to say that you're wrong, but I think that you're wrong. What I would do is so here's where I can conceive of you maybe being wrong, is imagine that you have a 2-column index like first name, last name, and the stats are on the first column, but over on the read-only secondary, you're running queries against last name, like find me all the people named Ozar, which thankfully there aren't that many of us. And then SQL Server needs a different statistic on that column. If you do think that it's 2 on the same column, 2 on the same first specific column, I would write a repro script, try to figure out how you can reproduce that from happening, because I don't think that's supposed to happen. I'm like straining for an edge case of trying to figure out where that would happen, and I got nothing. Next up, we have Sean, who says, my dumb friend inherited an Azure instance with auto-create indexes enabled and drops disabled. Okay, hold on a second. Let's just absorb that because that seems almost too bananas to be real. We're saying that Azure can create indexes anytime it wants, and yet it's not allowed to delete any. Can you think of any ways that that might go poorly? We're letting the robots automatically add indexes, and they're never allowed to drop any. Wonder what that might lead to. Gosh, maybe it's the tequila. I just can't. Oh, I wasn't supposed to say that was tequila, was I? Refreshing. It says the system created indexes have non-standard names. Well, yeah, because the robots are doing any names that they want. And the index, they might be non-standard to you, but it's perfectly standard to the robots. The index keys and et cetera are different in each database. He can't think of a way to implement death. He's thinking about the death method for mastering index tuning. Any thoughts on how to manage or script this out? Well, see, the thing with, let's see here. The experience with a random query in the secondary or a linked server point in the secondary. Right. So I would say try to script that out because I still think you're not quite right there. I still don't think that that's what's happening there. Okay, so the thing with, if SQL Server, well, there's a place where you ask questions and it's cleverly hidden at the top of the screen. I know y'all think that I have smart friends, but even my friends, people like Andy Mallon and Kenji, maybe it's because Kendra went to work for Microsoft and now she can't figure out how to read the thing that's up at the top of the screen that says ask a question or vote. It's right up there at the top. It's not at the bottom. It's at the top. You read from the top down. It's where you read. Read. Kendra even works on the documentation team. My God. Okay, so he can't think of a way to implement the death method. Any thoughts on how to script this out? So those tools in Azure where they automatically add and drop indexes, those are awesome for places where you don't have a full-time database administrator doing that work. Turn them on if you don't have a full-time database administrator doing that kind of work. But when you do have that full-time database administrator who's doing that care and feeding, turn off the automated tools because they are going to break the database in the way that you describe. Next up, and I love Kendra dearly and Andy, but there you go. Let's see here. Next up, we have Maurice. Some people call him Maurice. Do you see the same or different reoccurring issues in Azure SQL that you see in self-managed or installed SQL Server? When Azure SQL first came out, it wasn't exactly compatible with my... Well, I should be the only one who's... I think it's 4 o'clock where you're at. I don't think any of y'all should be drinking quite yet. It's 2 o'clock where I am, but I don't really have a job. I have a fake job, so it's kind of different. when Azure SQL DB first came out, it wasn't exactly compatible with SQL Server. There were things that you couldn't do in Azure SQL DB. Cross-database queries are a great example of that. So because of that, it lent itself very well to brand new apps that were created from the ground up, specifically for Azure SQL DB, and they started with relatively small sizes. So because of that, I saw different issues over there. Because if you're building a brand new application in the year 2022, or even 4 or 5 years ago, you tended to see a somewhat better quality of application because people were using more modern techniques. Today, I think the problems that I see that are different with Azure SQL DB and with managed instances and with hyperscale is the throughput sucks. The throughput on disk storage, whether you're reading or whether you're writing, is terrible. The log write throughput caps out in like 125 megabytes per second, which is slower than a USB 3 thumb drive. So the clients that I have who hit issues, it tends to be things around that, or things like tempdb changes that you couldn't reconfigure. As opposed to in on-premises, those things just aren't a big deal because my laptop can do like 3,000 megabytes per second. It's just not that big of a deal. So that's where they tend to be different, is the storage throughput. I keep thinking that we're just like a matter of time before all of a sudden the other shoe drops, or I guess in my case the other flip-flop drops, and Microsoft unveils massively faster disk throughput and catches up to a 1996 SAN. All of a sudden out of nowhere, Microsoft's going to be like, now instead of premium storage and ultra storage, we have hyper mega Power BI storage, and it's going to be like competitive with a $1,000 laptop, and then we'll be able to get past some of these hurdles. And then we'll do one more from the highly voted category. We'll check in with del-a-nooch. It's like del-a-noche, I suppose. A long-time listener, first-time caller. My backup admins are asking if they can exclude database data files from the daily server backups. Oh, that's good. I love that they're doing that. I'm taking regular SQL backups, so we have two different data centers. Can you foresee any problems with this approach? I am a huge believer in backing up databases, not servers. Servers, you should be able to just walk in, put a bullet in them, and rebuild them from scratch. And if that's a problem for you, go build the warm failover server now instead of waiting for the last minute to go do it. So that way you can do things like log shipping, always on availability groups, database mirroring, whatever. But I would never, ever, ever, in the year 2022, I would never restore a SQL Server from backup. Even if you have things like a failed upgrade or a failed patch, if it's so bad that a patch or an upgrade fails, what's your game plan to fix it long term? You're just going to wait and hope and pray that it's better the next time you do the patch or the upgrade? No, just switch over, fail over to another SQL server that you built from scratch. Same thing with things like storage corruption. Like once you start having storage corruption, if the disks where the SQL server binaries are involved, screw it. Don't bother restoring those. There's no check DB on things like that. So that's where I would go there. All right, so hopefully y'all had fun with today's office hours. This marks the last, it's Wednesday, yeah. It's probably going to be the last office hours I do down here in Cabo for a while. I am flying to BITS, flying to London for BITS on Saturday. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go delete the entire queue of all the questions that are out there so that we can start again from scratch. Greg says, Renegade says, I have something and then I forgot to read the thing at the top. That's okay, Renegade. I'm going to give you all kinds of hell for that when we go have dinner. Greg says, which breed of dog is SQL Server? Oh, it's going to be one of those. I would say either golden retriever or a Labrador, something that's really reliable, generally doesn't bite. You can have children. Andy agrees that SQL Server's a lab. Children can walk up to it and like tug its hair, and it's so patient and forgiving. You don't have to read a manual on how to work with a lab. They're just mellow. You know when you see them on the street, they're just totally approachable. You know how they're going to react. They're just charming. Now, they're not necessarily cheap if you want a good one, but they're just warm and loving creatures. Now, if you want them to do tricks, probably not the best kind of dog. They'll roll over and play dead, but they're not going to be going and fetching you a beer from the fridge. And I say that, and as soon as it comes out of my mouth, somebody's going to be like, here's a YouTube video of a lab fetching beers from a fridge. And I have all the time in the world for that because, dogs drinking beer from a fridge. All right, so thanks for hanging out with me this afternoon. I am now going to go down to the bar and get nachos. We have a pool bar here where I get my daily sustenance, which you can tell I'm not doing very well. Oh, golly, so very well there on the weight. Although I'm still staying around 200, but it's all gravitating towards one spot, which is kind of concerning. So I will see y'all at the next office hours. Adios.